Добрий день, друзі.
Good afternoon, dear friends. We're starting. I am Pavlo Kazarin. I will be the moderator of our round table. I believe that someone, just looking at how we're sitting, someone will betray someone. And the betrayal is rather an exception. We'll be discussing two draft laws which the Parliament will be voting for, and we would like to understand how they will change the rules of game for Ukraine. Today we have many speakers and more will join us, but we have very little time. We have two draft laws. First one is the draft law on media, and the second one, draft law on counteraction disinformation. We'll start from discussing the draft law on media. I just want to emphasize that, and I'm always talking about that we live in the world where information wars are not about something invented. We live in time of information wars, and there's a big difference between reality and how people perceive it, and that's all over the world. And even for those who are playing in this field, they're trying to change the perception of people of reality. I always give an example. French people believe that 25% of their compatriots are Muslims, but in reality it's only 8%, and these are the results of political battles when the issue of migration became so important for the agenda. And sometimes people are exaggerating the scales. We are trying to understand to what extent these draft laws can either improve or deteriorate the situation. I would like to give the floor first to the representatives of the platform where we are. Alexandra Tsikhanovska, the senior analyst of the UCMC. Let us try to speak for not more than 3 minutes. Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me, and please stop me if I speak longer than 3 minutes. I would like to say that Ukraine definitely requires renewal of legislation in the sphere of mass media, because most of that we inherited from the 90s, in the result of which we have some even dead legal norms, and we have commitments as to passing the new audiovisual code. But I believe that if we are talking about the directive of the European Union on audio and video services, then, for example, this draft law doesn't have a section on respect to cultural or language diversity, and that is the condition of this directive. What I would like to talk about, and that is what concerns me most, and it's about the status and powers of the National Council on TV and radio broadcasting, because Constitution defines that TV and radio broadcasting are the state-owned institutions, and the expanding powers of the National Council will lead to filing a case to the Constitutional Court. I believe that such things as requirements to submit annual reports and copies of agreements to the National Council could create a lot of burden for media and for the regulator, and this will make their work non-effective. And the National Council will not be able to conduct a real inspection, and they will be doing such inspections selectively with political goals. As to providing access to confidential information will violate one of the important laws. And also what is positive is that online media are recognized as mass media. We need to define what online media are, but the legislative recognition of this fact is for us a step ahead. Thank you. I'd like just to remind that this draft law on media should replace 5 media laws on TV and radio broadcasting, the law on press, on information agencies, on National Council of Ukraine, on TV and radio broadcasting, and one more which has a very long title. I will not mention it. And these draft laws were drafted in 1990s, and the authorities say they are to be renewed. But now people say that expanding the powers of the national constitution does not correspond to the constitution of Ukraine, and this draft law does not correspond to our commitments to European partners. We have one representative of authorities, the only person who can advocate this draft law. So please provide comments to that. Mr. Poturaev, your 3 minutes. It's difficult to do it within 3 minutes, but I will try. It does correspond because the working group, to the work of the working group, we invited the foreign experts. This working group worked with the support of the European Union and the Council of Europe. And definitely in the middle of February we will receive an expert opinion from the European Union, and this will be the opinion of that law, draft law, and I believe that we will need to introduce some amendments. As to the National Council, our understanding is that there are no constitutional threats there. When I worked together with Mykola Knyazhytskyy in the National Council, the philosophy of the regulator is not about inspecting everyone. The function of the National Council, and that's from the European experience, that is about inspecting when there are some grounds. The National Council's inspections, they are always selective. That has been the case always. And they are done only if there is some request that certain mass media violates the legislation. And if there are such, if there were some reasons, then even in cases In such cases, the inspection is conducted before the broadcaster is planning to get a new license. That is quite normal. We receive the reports. If there are no problems there, then why should they look into these reports? That's the case in reality. As to the personal data, we will work more on this provision, and there will be no threats for personal data, but the regulator will see them, and the operators, the providers agreed to that the regulator will see this database. And also I'd like to mention that we had many negotiations. We talked to many industries. With the Industrial Radio Committee today, for example, and we received the proposals as to amendments. We'll take them into account because they are all understandable. They are not changing the whole philosophy of this draft law. And if there are other proposals, you are welcome. Myself and Alexander are here, and you can submit them to us. From what we already received, we received the proposals from the members of the MCHEM. This morning I received the proposals from the Ukrainian information agencies. I'm sorry, I'm finishing. I just would like to say that there was such a point of view. Mr. Knyazhytskyy believed that we did not take everything into account of what he suggested as to transparency of ownership, and we are ready to take into account everything that he submitted, but then you need to look at his alternative draft law to understand that we will take into account these proposals, which means that these norms will become even stricter. Immediately I'd like to say why we give a little more time to the representatives of the authorities. In the Verkhovna Rada they are mono-majority, here they are mono-minority, and so they need more time to answer our remarks. My question is to Mr. Knyazhytskyy. If this draft law is approved in the format, in the version that it is now, what will be the perspective of that to the market, media market? But I would like to say that it will not be in this version in which it is now. Then everyone can talk about what needs to be changed there. We're here to discuss two draft laws. Our approach to regulating media is we need to limit any external influence. We need to control any attempts of influence from Russia or any foreign attempts which are illegal, but we need to also protect the diversity of the freedom of speech in Ukraine. When we were preparing our draft law, one item is that we need to leave without changes the mechanism of regulating the list of persons whose presence in Ukraine is not desirable, because this law is quite effective, and we are against making this mechanism softer. So basically the draft law is not bad from our point of view, but we are against making it political. This change is a political change which shouldn't be present in this draft law. for us it is important that Russian propaganda via this draft law, that it shouldn't come here without any limitations. There are other norms which should be corrected before the second reading. Our colleagues from the opposition talk about that. After comma, we call to limit the dissemination of the hostilities, but basically everything should be specified very clearly. What is mandatory? There should be mandatory registration of mass media. I just talk about the issues which are different from those which are in the draft submitted by the People's Servant faction. There are certain things which have been mentioned already, and another very important issue: mandatory registration of mass media online. We cannot agree to the approach when foreign media which legally act in Ukraine get some limitations. New York Times or Wall Street journals will have to be registered in Ukraine, for example. The registration of all the sites which provide access to education. Also, it concerns the subscriptions from Ukraine. If, for example, you want to buy something in Apple Store, the state of Ukraine shouldn't be regulating it. This shouldn't be regulated by the law on media. The reference to the fact that this registration is mandatory is wrong, because foreign media services are registered as in Verkhovna Rada, and draft law 2634 is on taxation on the services which sell services to Ukraine for the amount of more than 1 million hryvnias is to be taxed, but the law suggests to tax everything. We are against such registration, and we are not for everyone to get registered, but if someone violates the law, then their activity should be suspended, because people should have the right to protect themselves. Thank you. I just want to explain. The problem is when mass media start talking about media, it's like we understand what they are talking about, but some people probably will not understand. I would like to remind that this new draft law suggests, provides for prohibition for justification of occupation of part of Ukraine, and also prohibits to doubt the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It also prohibits materials which popularize the authorities of the state of aggressor. I just would like to emphasize that is what we were talking about, and it was about the idea that Netflix or other international companies, they should pay taxes in Ukraine. In fact, I have many questions about that. I would like to hear the position of the authorities and then of those who criticize this norm. There is a discussion about these so-called blacklists, but I would like to tell to everyone, we had two meetings, first with embassies of the European Union, Canada, Japan, the US. That was the second meeting, and also the meeting with the delegation of the European Union. What they confirmed, that it would be correct if the norm if you believe that they are not too strong, let's close that. But it would be worth if such norms about blacklists are duplicated in this law. Maybe there's a risk. I asked, they confirmed, there's a risk that in the European Court on Human Rights they can say that in media, law on media, there are no criteria, and so Mr. Hlobystin, welcome to Ukraine. And they say, try just duplicate it. Let's think about that and let's work on that. As to registration, you remember that we are for voluntary registration, but at the meeting with our online media, they said no, we are against voluntary registration. That's our Ukrainian mass media. We believe that everyone should be mandatory registered. All should be in equal conditions. Why certain Ukrainian big online portal or media should be in unfair conditions with New York Times or others? We need to discuss it again and come to an agreement. As to taxation, this is again the position of the industry. Our online media suffer. They even lose money because money go abroad. They're not taxed, it's all cheap, and they are in a difficult competitive situation. I thought that we need to take care of TV, first of all, which has some economic difficulties now, but we need to take care of Ukrainian internet as well, because they are very much limited in resources. That was the position of authorities. Yanina Sokolova joined us. We are talking about the draft law on media. In 20 minutes we'll start discussing the draft law on counteracting disinformation. We discussed the norm of the law, which provides for the fact that the collective Netflix should pay taxes in Ukraine. I understand that you disagree with what authorities suggest. I want to specify, it's not about some collective Netflix. What we mean, from our point of view, that's not the subject of regulation for this law. If certain group, Bugago, which broadcasts Russian serials, and they can compete with Netflix, and we are against such lobbyist corruption norms to be included into the draft law on media. And this is cannot be controlled. I mentioned that because these are small payments. This is an attempt of Ukrainian lobbyists to resolve their issues. In fact, I help to address the issues related to some license. It's an organization which works with the protection of now there will be the commission, and they are discussing the topic that there's no protection of the rights of those who are carriers of some content. Why this happens? Media, big TV channels got united, and they came to agreement with some organizations about some contribution, which is several million hryvnias a year. Basically, not to pay to the owners of the content that they use in their programs, and this way they will not be paying royalty that people are paying all over the world. First, you need to resolve the issue of protection of rights, but then you need to defend these rights. Then, talking about some platform like Netflix, if in our country, from the 28th of January, there were some TV channels blocked or the citizens of the occupied territories and those who we are talking to, they very often write to us after the signals were blocked in the satellites. Some of them had to buy tuners, and these companies are owned by two Ukrainian businessmen. One of them is directly linked to authorities. He's interested in this to happen. But what I mean is that there are very few people in our country who pay for using Netflix. If you look at how many people are interested in that and they watch this resource, this is a very small percentage of money which we which we spend for Netflix. I just talk about Netflix as an example. And I believe that this is just a cover of some other goal that Mr. Knyazhytskyy mentioned. So I am absolutely against. I understand what it is done for. And let's to first bring to order everything here in our country. There was an information from Interfax Russia that the fines are imposed on those who disseminate the resources which are not registered in Russia.
I have a proposal. Let's speak facts. And what are these facts? So, some accusations in lobbying, while speaking about it, throughout Europe, they tax digital platforms. This is a widespread practice. We are lagging behind a little bit in this process. Look. In Europe, they do not register Wall Street Journal and New York Times. This is not about industry and Europe and overall phrases about nothing. This is your invention. It won't work. Everyone understands this. Whether it is one part of industry or another part of industry with whom we speak, this contradicts European norms. This is all. If Europeans say that it doesn't correspond, please mention them. Who are these people? Name them. Is it a joke? We officially ordered an examination by the European Union, and the Council of Europe carries out it, and we will get it mid of February. This is a joint program. When you do it, we will analyze it. You say about the facts. So we should speak correctly about our partners, because the operator is the Council of Europe. It is financed by EU. This reminds me the situation that the delegation of EU said that this is okay, and it should be logic to carry out examination of the project, then to bring it to the committee together with this examination carried out by the European, the Council of Europe. We will be able to continue this discussion together with our European experts. we have a lot of participants. Not everyone was able to speak. If this norm raises concerns among the media experts, are you ready to get rid of it in this draft law in order to discuss it later? For example, in the discussions of the tax sphere, we are ready to change some norms that are now being discussed with the media experts. That's why we gather these amendments. As a Ukrainian politician, I should not be a media pirate, and I have subscription. And Trotsky, this is Russian series, is on the top of the rating, and this is propaganda of Bolshevism. This is not something stupid. There may be some Russian, sorry, shit in it. Some Russian series. And so I do not remember propaganda of communism in the Servant of People series. There was other propaganda. Solomiya Bobrovskaya is the next speaker. About the position of your faction, whether you support this draft law and what changes you want to introduce in order to support this draft law. Greetings. I have an counter-argument to Mykyta. When we appeal to the requirements of the European partners, we may remember many requirements when there were reforms in the judiciary sector and prosecutor sector. Some laws were adopted, and these were critical changes, and we should find consensus among factions, and we should include the opinion of the media community, because this is not less important issue than the land market, and it will be, we will test whether it will be able to be used, whether institutional mechanisms will be in place. Yeah, there are pluses and minuses, failures and successes. This should be a material for working further, and this may change its form until second reading, starting registration issues and other aspects. For me personally, this was the consideration of draft laws that takes in, that is connected with the issues of our security and what is going on at Russian and the Moldova border, and and there are some important aspects. For example, responsibility of audio and visual media concerning their call to changes of territorial division, and there were some cases in Kharkiv recently, and there is a no newspaper and Shari, and there should be proper response of the security service concerning the situation. And also in 2016-2017 there were printed media, and security service didn't respond to what was said in the printed media in the south, and we should also focus on them. Next, broadcasting as an exception, I cite if it is well grounded and provides information security. This is a big field for manipulation and interpretations. And this is more about regional media. And there are different opinions from Luganshina to Volyn. Third, National Council, big responsibilities, including consideration of cases on administrative violations, and the head of this body may impose fines, and here we have some concerns. And one more aspect that is really important, consideration of cases concerning state regulation. This will be within the responsibility of Kiev court and Judge Vovk and the stories connected to him. One more aspect. This is a technical issue, but we should work on this, and there should be changes into legislation about broadcasting in languages of indigenous peoples. We do not have this term in the legislation. There is no definition of who these peoples are. We should speak about it. In continuation of this topic, I would like to hear to Natalia Humeniuk, journalist, editor of Hromadske Television, member of the Council on Freedom of Speech and Protection of Journalists. I would like to add something new. And we would like to address the deputies. So this law does not see the elephant in the room. The key problem is that the owners of the media outlets are oligarchs. There is a market, 35%, they say, but this law may provide de-oligarchization of the media. This law should provide transparency, and there should not be monopoly in the market. And this is the main. Until there are big oligarchic holdings, everything else is minor. All other stories would be avoided using their influence. I would like to remind Bobrovskaya that I had an opportunity to see Slavkova-Karchuk, and he said that for Ukraine, one of the main laws is the oligarchization of the media, and this will help Ukraine to move forward. People say you should provide your version, you are journalists, and journalists, they focus on some problems, but we believe that we may reinforce the law with key important issues. There is no proper market. In the result, smaller media are not able to earn. I understand that maybe this is idealistic, and we spoke about it at UCMC platform and at other platforms, on other platforms. We like to prohibit things, but we do not help independent broadcasters that elaborate some products, cultural or news products. We should overcome the problem of oligarchs. There should be a fund for development of these media outlets. There should be instruments to simplify the work of the media, to reinforce this ecosystem. This would be good for the ecosystem. There should be proper criteria, and I understand that everyone got used to work in the oligarch system, but we are living in 2020. About some minor things. I believe we should be careful with the issues of polarization of the views, that prohibit some values, and we should understand that we should write about it carefully. There are many difficult topics, and journalists should not be afraid of speaking about these issues, and journalists should not be afraid of speaking of these things, because some people may consider this as propaganda. And also about the oligarchization. We do not understand what is the responsibility of the online media for non-registration or non-submission of the full list of information, IP addresses and other things, because this may be used as an element of pressure, and this is not clear at the moment. I would like to remind the main claims. This draft law does not create the oligarchization of the media market, also mentioning about the District Kiev Court that would resolve all the issues and establish legal consequences, and also responsibility of the media for non-registration or non-submission of the full list of data. I would like to provide brief response on the issue of de-oligarchization. Natalia, as a former journalist, I would like to say that all these mechanisms are in our legislation. We have anti-monopoly committee, and I addressed that as a deputy about cartel agreements and other things, and there is current law on anti-monopoly, and it regulates this. Anti-monopoly committee is inactive in the sector. That's why in our alternative draft law there is a point about responsibility for non-disclosure of transparency, and this will allow to identify these groups whether they violate anti-monopoly legislation. So we should just adhere to the laws that exist, and those bodies who are responsible, they should implement these laws. So National Council should not have these anti-monopoly functions. That's why it is correctly stated that anti-monopoly committee should do its work. Not a lot is said there, but unfortunately they were not able to reload everything, and their efficiency is under question. About responsibility, there were proposals. We will take them into account. We will look them through together in order not to create threats concerning responsibility of the journalists. In the framework of professional activity, maybe they need to show some separatist or someone in order that our society knows about it, and in order not to position it as propaganda. And also about the Kiev District Court. Maybe Alexandra will comment on this. The working group believed that there is legislation for this, and it should be considered in this court. About District Court, Alexander Bromagin was in the framework of this working group, the group that worked on this text, and we cannot deal with the issues of judiciary. So we cannot create some separate court in order not to have Mr. Vovk there, and this is not the truth in the last instance, this district court. I have a question to Natalia Humeniuk. Did you get answer? Responsibility for non-registration of online media. There are several levels envisaged by draft law: licensing, registration, and voluntary registration for online media. And if they do not do this, what will happen to them? Nothing. If we are speaking about online media, nothing happens. If they want, they register and they get official status for their journalists. And if they do not want to do this, they may continue their work as they did before, and the regulator may go to them only if they will violate content limitations. Dear friends, 1 second. Thank you, Natalia, for raising this issue of demonopolization and de-oligarchization. Maybe also we may speak about the change of the percentage in one hand, and about all national and local markets. This is about 35%. Maybe there should be decrease of the number of the property in one hand, maybe 25% or 20% of property in one hand. But there are some schemes for this. I would like to remind you that this is not only about television. There are also holdings concerning online platforms, other platforms, and in the world they consider separately these outlets, and you may be a monopolist even if you control different platforms, that they say in the world. We should shift to another draft law, and in my opinion it raises live discussion in society, this draft law on counteracting disinformation. What you've said, as I understand, for example, about so-called taxes for Netflix, this is a matter for arguments. What we see is whether it is lobbyism or an attempt to make order. And in mid-February we will get European conclusions concerning the quality of this draft law. Maybe something will be changed. Now, draft law on counteracting disinformation, promoted by the Ministry of Culture and Youth and Information Policy. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, so I would like to give the floor to representatives of the platform on which this event is held, and I would like to give the floor to Alexandra Tsikhanovska, senior analyst of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Do you hear me? I will start. There is no sense to say that propaganda is a threat, and in UCMC we study the media influence by Russia, and the main narratives we see that they present Ukraine is not a state or fascist state or Russophobic state or puppet of the West, and the Kremlin calls the war civil war. This is not only on Russian TV, unfortunately. We may hear it in Ukrainian channels, and also we may watch it online. In this context, I greet the initiative of updating legislation, but I believe that this work should be more comprehensive. This is a big challenge. And also about media draft law. Once again, I have several propositions, but I would like to focus. I see two problems. They are brought to discussion today. This is definitions and the problem of mechanisms that are they are interrelated. I would like to speak briefly about definitions. The main definition of disinformation. I agree that it is difficult to elaborate legally a viable term. We should put effort in this, because now this creates a field for abuse, and in these conditions the most problematic is the criteria of the fullness of information, because we understand that information should correspond to this criteria, the information provided by the governmental bodies. But journalists and those who spread information, they do not always have full access. And those who spread information, this is a second term I would like to draw your attention to. And a lot has been said about it, because in the form it exists now, it allows to bring to responsibility any user of social media, despite whether it was done intentionally or not, whether this information was spread intentionally or non-intentionally, because we understand that unfortunately level of media literacy in our country is really low. And in these conditions, if we are realistic, we should not put this responsibility on all users of social media. We also may speak about a person who, about ombudsman on this issue. If we are speaking about mechanisms, maybe my colleagues will tell about Association of Professional Journalists. I would like to say that this idea of stratification of profession through ranking, it should not be our priority if we would like to introduce such practice. I believe that this is doubtful. My personal position. For example, Mr. Portnov, if he becomes professional journalist, he will be more of a threat to us. And if we're speaking about journalist ethics, about information security, maybe we should look at editor's policy of TV channels connected with Medvedchuk, because all those narratives I've mentioned at the beginning, we observed this in our research. Unfortunately, we may hear this in our TV broadcasting. And I would like to give the floor to Victoria Romaniuk. I know she is an expert in the field. So this is self-regulation of the journalists. It looks like this. I'm not responsible for the issues of round tables. Yeah. Thank you, Alexandra, for giving me the floor. I agree with everything that was said. I believe that people understand that this draft law is needed. I'm against it. I believe we shouldn't do it. On behalf of Stop Fake organization that has been working for 6 years with the topic of fakes and propaganda, we are fully convinced that this is needed. Last week, we mentioned Debaltseva. Unfortunately, this event was not mentioned a lot in our media, and we raised these facts provided by Russian propaganda, and I would like to say that maybe we forget about these things, but we should not forget about them. What happened in the media space in the Russian Federation and what is ongoing, as Alexandra mentioned, in our media space, there are a lot of fakes and disinformation. And we should do something about it because they are all illegal. There are issues of definitions and how we should properly regulate these things. The definition of disinformation, manipulation, fake, this is a difficult definition. We should work on these issues for years, and there will be new technologies that will appear in the future, and we should think about it carefully. About mechanisms, Alexandra said that there are things, and here there may be one more aspect about criticism about this draft law, and it can be heard loudly in the media sphere. The attitude to the draft law and emotions concerning authors, political forces. I would like to ask you to stay calm and to differentiate things. If you read it carefully, a lot in this draft law, if you speak about media literacy, there are things about comprehensive approach, appearance of courses on media literacy, some educational processes should be in place. About criminal responsibility, who are those who spread this fake? This, for example, this is some Baba Manya, and she spreads this fake, for example, but there should be systematic spread of the fake information. For example, 3 incidents per year. So some things are thought through. The issue of definitions, mechanisms, and identification, these issues should be thought through. Also, there are some positive aspects. This draft law is submitted to consideration, and it is good that we discuss it. And also, there was information that this draft law will be revisited, and I believe we should identify clearly those disputable issues, to discuss them. We should establish proper definitions and also consider issues concerning criminal responsibility. We should work on this draft law more, and we should not say whether it is needed or not. And I believe, and I'm speaking on behalf of our organization, that now we understand properly that these things are really needed.
In fact, the discussion whether this draft law is needed for the society is also part of the democracy, and I don't want to take this opportunity from participants, but just want to remind you, if you want to speak, you're welcome. Just give me a signal. Just one remark. This draft law is 135 pages long, and sometimes I believe when we discuss this draft law, it's like people who do not see, who are blind, and they try to describe the elephant, and one says that the elephant is like a snake, another one says that it's like a pole. And this draft law suggests to create the index of trust, the index of quality for mass media, and during the year mass media will be able to mark their materials with this index, and those also they create this ombudsman who can demand from social networks the data about their users so that they are no more anonymous. And thirdly, it creates the system of fines or penalties, introduces the notion of information and disinformation, and there's the system of fines which could be up to 4 or even more million hryvnias. Some people believe that this will be good for media business. Others believe that this is creation of a censorship hammer. When you are a hammer and everyone around you is nails. Does the country need this draft law? If yes, then in which form? And I would like to say that Ukraine needs this draft law. Not everyone is for it. I was discussing it with Roman Skripin, and we discussed all the problems, and we were trying to find something positive in this draft law, talking about disinformation, the disinformation which influences on national security. That's mostly information, and disinformation which is disseminated by pro-Russian mass media, the TV channels of Medvedchuk, Mr. Portnov, bloggers who you know, starting from Shiri and down to some Klimenko's publications, all should be focused. There should be the norm created which will ensure that there are no such mass media in the information space. I see some threats. All these things, they do not protect us from those who are mentioned. They usurp what we are doing. And now back to the first law, and that is in the second law as well, in the second draft law as well. I agree, we do need the norm which would impose fines, would withdraw licenses, because there's no control, no disciplinary or administrative responsibility, and that's scary. Look at the figures. There were, if now people would vote, just look at the surveys how this changes, what changes are there. But I believe that this law does not create any protection for us, for journalists, and it does not help us counteract those who create fake news. What you see sometimes, no one's talking about that. There's the site Ukraine.ru. There was something written about me, and when I click it, I get to Strana UA. Why don't we create the mechanism that would help us clean our information space? I'm against this draft law in this version. My team with who I work, these are people from different TV channels. I will not mention the names, but most people would like to see this law because we are have some successes when we are involved in counter propaganda. We have a minimum content which is anti-fake, but we are drafting the laws. I would like to request the authorities, please change this draft law. We will join us, and media lawyers are ready to join. There was a discussion in the Institute of Journalism, and I believe I'm against that. I am for draft which would minimize the chance for pro-Russian mass media to be in Ukraine to manipulate the mentality of our people who are still in TV. Let's register certain statements which are important. We are in the state of war. The war has an information dimension. We need to protect the citizens from fakes and disinformation, but we need to understand how we'll be doing it and whether we will not create some censorship hammer which will turn into censorship boomerang. I remember, you have to leave us earlier, and I will give the floor to you. That's Solomiya Bobrovskaya. So, Solomiya, you're welcome. First of all, I believe that the Ministry of Youth and Sports were mistaken in the country. They failed to do that in 2010, but and that cannot happen in Ukraine in 2020. Second, these people are not just nails, but I believe that such disinformation is about activities of journalists, and this will be Kazakh or Belarus definition of journalist. I'm infuriated by the Association of Journalists, which they suggest to be created, that minimum experience is 3 years and index of trust. The students who graduate, how will they then practice? That's again something which I dislike. And then that the professional journalist should have the right within the reasonable term to get to the to have access to the civil servant, but it's beyond the normal norms. I'm absolutely against it. This draft, that the Parliament shouldn't see this draft law, and it's good that you mentioned that you will work more on that, and we can talk about excessive powers. This should be important for journalists. This should become the instrument of work with information. This should be for you but not against you. Mykyta, could you comment? I will have a brief, so that you do not laugh. We are also against this draft law in the version in which it is. I requested you not to laugh. But, in fact, members of the committee from servant of people servant, in this version in which it is, we believe there are many bugs there which are to be fixed. And besides, the draft law received negative opinion from a working group that wrote the law on media, the draft law on media. Alexander made some critical analysis. So basically, it's not in the committee, and we did not even plan to take it in the committee. Volodymyr Borodiansky said that we need to discuss, to continue discussions. We need to continue working on this draft law. What doesn't suit you? Everything that was mentioned. Okay, you can fix some bugs, but you can add more bugs. Then it will take a lot of time if I start talking about that. Now, on my personal position, I absolutely agree with colleagues who professionally are fighting with fakes and disinformation. I believe that the law is needed. I believe that there's no place for discussion here. No space for discussion here, because we understand that it's 6 years already, but it hasn't stopped, and it will not be stopped, probably, this disinformation. But definitely the law should give us all the chance to get protected, but we need to think about freedom of speech. A small question to you, may I? That's my position. Mykyta, who are the authors of this draft law? When I read who they are, I didn't sleep for half a night. The ministry created a working group. It was coordinated by Natalia Humeniuk, who is a media lawyer. It was easier for us with this law because first there was a big work done in the council by the parliament. And there was this draft law on visual and visual services, and Alexander worked on this first draft. Even then, we had something to start from. There was a big piece of work done, and we received the support from European partners, and the working group managed to continue its work. And the law on disinformation, you know, talking about media, that's part of our commitments, but on disinformation, that's how, that is, if we're interested in that, we need to continue this work. And that is why the quality is such, but we need just to work on it, to work more. And people who were initiators of this draft law, they say that now there is no institutional program in the world how to counteract disinformation and how to overcome fakes. There was something done in France when, after the victory of Emmanuel Macron, they created their system of protection from disinformation. That happened after Macron called Russia today not mass media but platform for manipulation. They started developing their legislation, but there's no package solution which could be brought to Ukraine and could be implemented into national legislation so that it works. That's why the authors of this draft law insist on creating something new. But if we create something and if we protect our domestic consumer, then how this should be done. I would like to give the floor to Roman Shutov, and he's also the media expert. Ukrainians are people who like writing and then rewriting. Usually we need to start from the dialogue of stakeholders, but that is what we either ignore or imitate. If there were such a dialogue organized for this draft law, then we could have avoided many things. Now it's obvious that there are some items in this document against which the stakeholders are they're absolutely against. The journalists will not allow the state to create one single body for self-governance for them. International partners will be against, and some of them express their position publicly, but they are against. They say that violating the anonymity online is a red line and Ukraine shouldn't cross it. Then I'm interested in what Telegram and Facebook think. If this law is passed, if these items are passed, then they will have to register their offices in Ukraine. And that's quite an innovation. Also, Pavlo mentioned the data of the users and the users of the social media. We are all users of Facebook. We disseminate the information. We need to publish our surname, name, contact data. How do you imagine Ukrainian user Tinder who is publishing his name and other things? These are the things which had to be discussed at the stage of conceptual discussion. So we need to start discussing the concept. Also, I support Yanina and her position that this law does not suggest any effective instruments to counteract propaganda. The definitions are described in such a way. Disinformation, there's no definition of the assessment which is not disinformation. But how can you prove in the court that this was just your assessment but not disinformation? Then, if the law is passed, then the News One will invite Vitrenko and someone else, and they will, as guests of the studio, they will talk about bloodshedding junta in Kiev, and no one will pay the fine. Huge blocks of disinformation are taken out of the of this draft law, and some of them are there. Well, basically, I will add a couple of words on assessments and disinformation. I whispered to Mykola, like Bogdan whispers to Zelensky. Two claims are registered in the court against me, and two are for what I've written in the Facebook. And these are people, they are MPs from non-Ukrainian camp, and they just use it as the PR. If this law is passed, then I can basically I would have to pay fine, or I would have to go and work on compulsory works. So basically, in the morning I will be working as the host of TV, and in the evening I will be cleaning some streets. Basically, not you, but some journalist sort of violated and received such a sentence. So these are not the mandatory works after your main job, but that's what you should do instead of your job. So instead of the words that you use in YouTube, you will have to use the antonyms. Now we're discussing not just this draft law, because we understand that it will be changing. Basically, that's more about whether we need to regulate the information space or not. If so, then how and using what means. Natalia Humeniuk, I believe that this draft law will be impossible to finalize. It should be withdrawn. And first we need to define what problem are we addressing. The main topic of disinformation, it's not what should be used from YouTube channel, which comes from abroad, and that's a big source of what people are talking against. This does not protect us against it. And first of all, it's not about finalizing this draft law. Criminalization is impossible for journalist activities, and also this is dangerous, and de facto this draft law introduces self-censorship and maybe even censorship. Among the authors of this law, some authors, they believe that they are from mass media and they help us. They are not helping mass media. People who work with that are the state and civil servants, and the state shouldn't be regulating journalists. I am negative as to some legislative initiatives as to counteracting disinformation. All that should be in the legislation on national security. Otherwise, we're getting to some other territory, and I believe that the issue of pluralism is present in Ukraine, and there's certain self-censorship. We work with the media. We see how many journalists there talking about Donbass. People are afraid to talk about that, and I also believe that certain norms will I believe we are all afraid, and we follow the global trends. I don't like when they take some phrases from the context. You cannot say that there was something in France. There are other things there, and I see that the only thing is that journalists should be called to self-regulation, and the journalists have to get self-regulated. And second, I believe, I will repeat it, that it's about national security, but this disinformation should be overcome by creating the market where independent and high quality and quality journalists work. We should think about certain support, and when it is, then people will understand who they trust and who they do not trust.
And now Vitaliy Moroz, Internews-Ukraine program manager of New Media. I follow the discussion of both draft laws in the public sphere, and I believe that in Ukraine civil society they have some birth trauma. Any draft law that is proposed by the government, it is considered in connection with the previous draft laws, and this discussion was emotional. There were many concerns, and this is good, but here we clearly see a total classic mistrust to any governmental institutions, to the government. There's no understanding of value of government because they compare it with the government of Yanukovych. And this and previous government, they should not be compared with the Yanukovych's government because they are different. Are you from Internews? And yeah, there are two legal traditions. One is limited responsibility, and second is broad immunity. This is more widespread in the USA, and this draft law is more connected to this limited responsibility for journalists. I do not protect the law on disinformation, but I agree with Victoria that this question, it exists in the public discourse, and those who promoted the idea concerning disinformation, there were parliamentary hearings in the previous convocation of the Verkhovna Rada, and now they do not speak about it. And there are grounds for criticism, but it cannot remove this issue from agenda. What I would like to say is the status quo and return to 2014. We should understand that the journalist community will provide answers to these questions. I would like to believe in journalist community, but we should remember that our media, they are weak, and when we have fines of 2 or 4 million, even at psychological level, people have the different realia, those who propose ideas and those who live in conditions of Ukrainian journalism. When we are trying to legally regulate some things connected with common sense and logic, sometimes it is really difficult. That's why I would like to hear the opinion of Tatiana Kotyuzhinska, the president of the Association of Media Lawyers, about draft law on disinformation. The biggest problem is the aim of this draft law. I would like to say that we didn't achieve this level when the issue of state communications is at the proper level, in order to shift to the position of punishment and bringing to responsibility in this form. I would say that we need state communication, and there should be proper standards how to respond. The ministry and officials, how they should respond. On one of the TV channels, together with Mr. Poturaev, we discussed the issues of disinformation. And after this, there was communication from the journalists of Hromadske Radio that fake information was spread, and it was rejected in 1 hour by Hromadske Radio, and it was not rejected during 24 hours by the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and this is about responsibility of journalists and media outlets. But first of all, government officials should be responsible for non-provision of information or non-timely provision of information, and they should be held responsible if they do not provide information to journalists timely. And we should think about the body that would efficiently bring to responsibility. And SBU, we believe that this is not an efficient body for this. I believe that we have enough criminal responsibility for crimes against national security. We have enough of them in order to, but we should have efficient work of the special body, SBU, that is responsible for carrying out investigations under these articles, and also holding of examinations, proper court hearing practice, and based on this there should be proposals concerning possible changes to legislation. This work is not done, and instead they propose to provide grave criminal responsibility and to provide other bodies. So this body is not able to do this. Let's do one more. Let's create one more. And why should we do it? And also during one of the presentations, an opinion was expressed that we should create a lot of information, and we should create some sort of a dome over all Ukrainian society, but this doesn't correspond with the direction that is mentioned and stated in our constitution. I would like also to mention constitution and laws concerning the law on media and disinformation. I believe that this is the main, because the law on the media, it should be based on the norm of the constitution, Article 92.11, concerning the fact that the basis for the activity of media outlets, they are based on the laws of Ukraine, and Article 82, that the National Council about the Committee on the radio and TV broadcasting, and also law on disinformation also includes the violation of several norms. This is prohibition of censorship, and the state may limit information that was spread, not only information that will have intention to be spread, by creating some professional associations of journalists, and also equality of all the citizens despite of membership in any civil unions, and there is equality of all associations before the law, whether the state identified them as their favorite wife or not. And everyone should be equal, and the state cannot provide this self-regulation. Thank you, Tatiana. I also would like to give the floor to Mr. Galavienko, and he is Deputy Director of Mass Media Institute.
Basically, when the Information of Culture and Sports started to draft this draft law, they invited some pool of experts, and I was at the first of such meeting, and I expressed my opinion on their conceptual approach, and Roman said that disinformation is described narrowly, and the disinformation is not limited to the non-true information, informing about the facts that did not exist, but they did not, that there was an instruction to develop the draft law on disinformation, and after that the working group developed something, and they presented the draft law, and the table of comparisons is 130 plus pages long. And the audience which consumes mass media is not homogeneous. We have 3/4 of the population which watch national channels, and we had to pay more attention to oligarchic TV channels. Now there's some distortion. We discussed the text of the draft law, but having the law on TV and radio broadcasting and on National Council, we need to do it so that our information space is of higher quality than now. And there should be an effective professional council, and that if we could ensure journalist standards, then for the most of the population, it would be more difficult to disseminate fakes. For that, we need to have a proper national council. Those, unfortunately, it's not there, and that doesn't mention the standards of journalism. I hope that certain proposals, our proposals, will be taken into account. As to other, this quarter of audience that takes information from many sources. Some of the users, if a person is pro-Russian, then they still listen to these channels. Then about bottle farms and troll factories. On the one hand, we have a big responsibility that's scarce, and it's not balanced. Thank you. In the end, I'd like to mention that we can get some opposite effect. Any attempts to regulate and fight disinformation will lead us to the situation that we will not have any possibility to influence the content. I understand that today here nothing unites mass media people and authorities as the draft law on mass media. I understand that our time is over. I would like to apologize. It's strange when the faction invites me to talk about the draft law on counteracting disinformation, but I have no chance to do that. The colleagues said a lot. I could just add. Mykyta Poturaev, who's here, is my good friend, and when I criticize the draft law on media, that doesn't mean that I differently now I have different attitude to Mr. Poturaev. The same is true about Mr. Brodyansky. We are discussing the draft law, and I would like to invite you, Internews and you, to talk not about attitude of different people, but about draft law. If we talk about even draft law on media, when Natalia Humeniuk says, what will happen if I do not get registered, everyone says nothing will happen, it's your choice, but that's not so. If she creates free of charge resource, nothing will happen, but if she wants to place advertisement, then she will have to pay up to 300,000 fine. When we're talking about the law on disinformation, then the biggest problem there, I agree with what you say, but assessment will be removed from this law. And there are no definitions, and we do not understand what it is, but the fact that the citizen should not just get registered. It's not just the office of Google and Facebook. They have to open offices here. In Russian legislation, they shouldn't be doing it. This law is stricter than Russian laws. they copied part from China, but the law is awful. And if the citizen who 3 times reposted, and it's not systematic, if you are a granny and you made 3 reposts about the dog that was sold for gas, then they can make you criminally responsible, irrespective of what is our attitude to the committee. But let's work with text. Let's not write some absurd things. Thank you. No? Thank you for being with us.